With the season upon us, many of us are revisiting old Christmas classics like 1994's The Santa Claus, but many viewers are skeptical about calling this a comedy movie when it fits under the description of horror. The famous movie has spun out multiple sequels and spin-offs, but why are audiences starting to categorize it as a horror movie now? Today we'll go through that and other movies fans consider to be horror. Let's begin. Starting off, let's see what the premise of the film is. The Santa Claus is an adored Christmas film, but it's also a horror film in its own right. After causing Santa to fall off his roof, businessman Scott Calvin becomes the new Saint Nick in the Santa Claus. Despite Scott's skepticism about Santa, his son Charlie inspires him to embrace his transformation into Santa, which Scott eventually sees as a wonderful gift. The Santa Claus would go on to become a holiday season classic, inspiring 2 sequels as well as the new Disney Plus miniseries, The Santa Clauses. Even though the Santa Claus films have no shortfall of vibrant Christmas magic on the exterior, lurking beneath is a pretty dark and deeply disturbing story about a man who's supernaturally morphed into someone he does not even recognize. To be sure, The Santa Claus is a heartwarming story about a divorced father trying to rebuild his relationship with his child and ex-wife as he realizes how much good he can bring into the world as Santa Claus. However, when it comes to how Scott becomes Santa, the movie shares a more common theme with horror films than most holiday films. Moving on, let's see how Calvin's transformation into Santa is actually horrifying. Scott's conversion into Santa Claus is intended to be funny, and his hair whitens and he puts on weight in an instant. Yet such an inexplicable paranormal transformation would be terrifying for anyone experiencing it. His attempts to shave and dye his hair are pointless, and he develops sugar cravings on par with Seth Brundle in The Fly. It has a surprising amount in common with body horror, without the Christmas holiday magic of Santa himself, as Scott's body is transformed entirely against his will. There's also the idea of Scott becoming Santa at a deeper internal level, with Santa essentially overriding and replacing Scott's mind. Scott literally loses his identity when he accidentally startles the previous Santa and causes him to drop from his roof, and his earlier efforts to persuade Charlie, and perhaps even himself, that he isn't yet Santa fade, as the Santa identity ends up taking over. That's dark content for a Christmas film, and it implies that Santas are not only coerced into the role, but are also essentially disposable when a new candidate tends to come along. Next up, did you know that the original has already been reimagined as a horror movie? Recutting family films to look like horror films in fan-made previews is a pretty popular YouTube trend, and the Santa Claus's characters and plot have been the topic of a few notable creators. Throughout the trailer, Scott and Charlie's journey to the North Pole is defined in a far more malevolent light, with Scott kidnapping Charlie the following year. Scott's police interrogation scene is also much darker, with Scott's description of different names for Santa in different cultures sounding like names for a serial killer. While it demonstrates how even Santa Claus's Christmas spirit can be turned upside down, it surprisingly doesn't really touch on many of the story's central themes as they apply to Scott. As The Santa Claus demonstrates, the film doesn't need to be modified to be considered a horror film. Moving on, will the Santa Claus TV series adaptation brand itself as a horror show? The Santa Claus series clearly illustrates itself in the fanciful style of the holiday season, but it begins to call into question some aspects of the franchise's fairy tale-like story. After surviving his own fall from the roof, Scott observes that the last Santa's apparent demise seemed to have little impact on his elves when Scott and Charlie initially showed up. Scott's decision to retire is also influenced in part by his and his family's desire to live outside of the North Pole. In some ways, the show is impressively candid about the fact that life as Saint Nick may not be as fun and magical as it appears to most people. Scott's transformation from Santa to himself through the series also demonstrates how much he is at the hands of the often ambiguous laws of the Santa Claus. Claus's deconstruction of what it takes to be Santa also uncovers how tirelessly Scott has to work just to be Scott again, despite the fact that he and his family are entirely unfamiliar with an existence without year-round Christmas joy. The Santa Clauses does not pose any of these questions in a frightening manner, but with even Charlie declining to become Santa, they must doubt if the abilities that come with Santa are worth what Scott is willing to sacrifice. Just like the Santa Claus, there are many more movies that at first glance may seem like a comedy, sci-fi, or thriller movie, but upon further inspection inspection, they turn out to be terrifying films that we can easily classify as horror. Let's take a look at our list of the top movies that are actually horror movies. Starting off, we have Requiem for a Dream. The psychological drama Requiem for a Dream is frightening, not because of any monsters or unexpected violence, but because of the accurate and unnerving depiction of addiction. The movie follows four main characters as the heroin addictions cause them to spiral and self-destruct. There are a few terrifying hallucination scenes in the film, but what truly makes Requiem for a Dream a horror are the sickening fates each character faces, which include amputation, forced prostitution, and electroshock therapy. The film is a masterpiece that ends up leaving you completely empty afterward. Not to mention that hauntingly beautiful soundtrack. Next up, we have Batman Returns. Tim Burton's follow-up to his amazing adaptation of DC's Dark Knight is a great example of what can occur when a director is given complete creative control. Batman emerges as the hero Gotham requires, but characters such as Catwoman and the Penguin are given a totally distorted makeover. Catwoman is a psychopath addicted to adrenaline, and the Penguin is a creepy entertainer with a history of kidnapping and killing children, not to mention the creepy depiction of the villains and the haunting soundtrack used. What else could Burton possibly add to the horror? Watch and find out. Moving on, we have Seven. Crime thrillers frequently explore dark and eerie subject matter, but very few do it as well as Seven, following two detectives on the trail of a serial killer who murders victims based on the 7 deadly sins. Seven's horror roots begin to emerge. Most of the gore is left to the viewer's imagination, which may make some deaths even more horrific. The implications of what happened to the victims of greed and lust will send shivers up anybody's spine. Furthermore, few viewers will forget Seven's infamous box reveal or the terrifying scene with the sloth victim. Next in line, we have The Terminator. To put it simply, The Terminator is a slasher film with a sci-fi theme. Just because the titular humanoid isn't wielding a machete or another classic sharp object of horror doesn't mean he doesn't qualify as a slasher. Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese spend most of the movie getting chased and terrorized by an unstoppable and unavoidable killing machine, similar to the teenagers who fall victim to a slew of masked assassins. It sounds like the standard horror formula, especially keeping in mind how the audiences are on the edge of their seats throughout the film. Moving along, we have Zodiac. True-life horror films are almost always scarier because they appear to be true. Zodiac by David Fincher is technically a mystery thriller, but because it is based on the actual unsolved Zodiac killer case, it ramps up the scares a bit. Fincher infuses the film with an undeniable feeling of dread and a few truly terrifying scenes. The creepy basement scene alone is enough to make viewers flee the room in real life as fast as Jake Gyllenhaal's character does in the film, and even the rest of the film is no less terrifying. Next, we have Disney's A Christmas Carol, yet another movie disguised under the joy of Christmas but is actually pretty scary. The CGI adaptation of A Christmas Carol by Disney is terrifying, but so is the original book that it's based on. Yes, it tells the classic story of Ebenezer Scrooge and his deliverance, but it also amplifies every element that made the book so creepy. It's been said before, but A Christmas Carol is a ghost story first and a Christmas story second. Both the book and the Disney adaptation are filled with ghosts and rotting corpses, and the plot begins with someone dying. Including ideas like the past, present, and future haunting a person adds a layer of horror with terrifying existential dread and adds nuance to the overall haunting theme. Moving on, we have Annihilation. Few sources agree on the genre of the phenomenal Annihilation. Some described it as science fiction, others as mystery, and still others as action, but many fans have frequently labeled it as a straight-up horror film. It's easy to see why, as Annihilation's deeply disturbing premise leads to a slew of disturbing scenes. The film contains a literal stomach-churning body horror moment, a nuanced alien doppelganger, along with one of the freakiest non-horror movie monsters ever seen on a movie screen. Annihilation almost certainly gave those who didn't know exactly what they were getting into nightmares. And lastly, we have Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Fans may argue that the beloved Harry Potter series began to take a darker turn near the end of the Goblet of Fire, but this movie was unquestionably one of the darkest chapters in the saga. The film establishes Sirius Black as a demented dark wizard, the magical equivalent of a serial killer, and that's before we even get to the Dementors. This feels out of character from the last two films, but it was also the point at which the saga began to take on its own identity. This film made fans realize that not all magical beings are all good, like Dumbledore or Dobby. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think The Santa Claus should actually be considered a horror movie? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.